Okay, hello everybody. We have Shams, Lapgong, SJ, and myself today. Shams was raised in Niger and came to the UK as an asylum seeker. He has spent some time on humanitarian efforts with different associations. Lapgong, on the other hand, has spent some time in Singapore, Hong Kong, and in America, where he was studying for years, and is a huge proponent of libertarian beliefs. SJ identifies himself a bit more in the left authoritarian sphere, and he has obtained a master's revolving around Chinese studies. Today's discussion would be on Western civilization. Could you classify Western civilization as the best civilization that's ever existed? We'll go with SJ, Lapgong, and then Shams. As always, keep civil and try to let people get into the convo as much as you can to keep the flow going. SJ, what do you think?
I think I want to start with this by saying I am uncomfortable with saying something is the best or is superior because I don't really subscribe to the sort of clash of civilizations theory that's come out of thinkers such as Huntington. But if I have to draw a list of pros and cons of Western culture and Western civilization and compare it to other cultures, it is innately uncomfortable for me to admit this because I do not want to come across as a Western chauvinist. But I do lean to agreeing that Western culture has and civilization has more pros, but it's also perhaps, given the most good overall to the world than any other civilization. And that's not to diminish other civilizations, but when you think about what Western culture has contributed, I would say some of the greatest inventions and discoveries in the world has come from Western civilization. Some of the best philosophy, from your right-wing libertarian Adam Smith philosophy to Marxist philosophy, all has its roots within Western civilization. Some of the best thinkers. Modern Western civilizations, sure, they have their flaws, but generally speaking, people there have more freedom to live their life how they want to, more rights, greater opportunities. I would say the majority of the world, regardless of what civilization they're from, would rather live in a Western civilization. I think it's contributed, if it's not just economics, if you look at contributions to art, literature on a global scale, Western civilization has contributed the most. That's not to say it's not flawless, it has a dark past, but I really wanted to reflect on it from a more modern Western civilization and the current state of the world. And I would say broadly, it has more in the pros column than other civilizations.
All right.
Well, do you mind if I start next?
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me start off this conversation, my contribution to this conversation with a story. I talked with a person who is a pollster, but he was a former PhD student and worked in Westminster for about a decade. And every time we would try to talk about subjects, it would always roll back to the subject of race. I do actually believe that Western civilization is probably the best form of living ever devised to mankind, which, coming from somebody like me, a chauvinist Hong Kong nationalist who hates mainlanders, is not unexpected or even saying a lot. But what really makes it so profound is that Western people, and let's just say it, white people, don't really understand the type of society they've made. They have created a society in multiple countries, despite being only 16% of the global population, that has combined a modicum of economic freedom with some sort of representative, in Marxist terms, bourgeois democracy. However, for most of the rest of the world, dare I say it, any non-white country Democracy and prosperity are not intertwined. If anything, they are almost mutually exclusive. If you look at all of the prosperous East Asian countries, or the prosperous African countries, or Latin American countries, they all have had to balance their policies as if freedom and prosperity were repelling each other. Let's go to Chile. Chile is one of the few countries in the world that nearly mimics an Anglo-Saxon country. But even then, it's faced constitutional problems that risk making its economic model not working. And then you have Hong Kong, Singapore, East Japan, South Korea, and China. When I talk to my British progressive friend, and he is a very nice man, you know, he's often chided me for being anti-Black and racist and all of that. But this is the same type of person who says to me, that's what I don't like about East Asian culture, it's so racist. And he has this inability to conceive that all Asian countries, other than China, also face the same problem, which is the trade-off between prosperity and liberty. So before I end this my portion of this talk, I want people to realize that Western civilization, either through the innate intelligence of some people, or maybe even worse, pure luck, is probably not replicable and probably should not be replicated unless people can find a way to appreciate universal values. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. I'm a bit tired. That's why I'm rambling.
All right, Shams.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yeah, my name is Shams, and indeed, I'm an African living in United Kingdom. I'm a sanctuary seeker. In my life, probably I've been part of many things, from campaigning to Westminster to, getting involved in my own country with, emancipating or empowering people to come to realize their potentiality. But the most important thing that I want to ask today, you guys, we're talking about Western civilization compared to which civilizations? That's one thing. And when did the Western civilization started? That's one. Let's say two. And most of the Western civilization, if we take it, I hear some of you, my colleagues, are saying that it's the best. But every civilization in its time seems to be the best during that time. The Ottoman Empire, that time, the civilization was the best. The pharaohs, in that time, the civilization was the best in that, in that era. You take the Byzantine, Constantinople, all those civilizations are the best in their times. My point is, at some point in life, every civilization will rise and fall. And I think, please forgive me because I forgot to write down the name of this gentleman that may say that any greater civilization cannot fall from the outside, but within its own walls. And that's the same thing. Any bigger civilization do not basically fall from an outside wall. They have to be fall from within the inside. And why? Because most of the time, people that are in power get so greedy than the people below will rise and then basically end up. Saying this quickly, before we have the Western civilization, we have writings in Africa, we have empires in Africa. But excuse me to saying this, the Western civilization has basically put it down the way that we do not even talk about it. There was Ming dynasties in China, many dynasties. And there are even Black dynasty in China, if I might say. I will basically put the research to Nick, but you never heard about that. How often do you hear about African civilization? or the contribution to Africa during civilization, apart from the pyramid. But that's not it. Africa did not start with the construction of the pyramid. The African history did not start with that. So when people basically compare the Western civilization, I'm just wondering to what? Because Africa is a socialist continent. Most of countries in Africa, you don't have salt, you ask your neighbor. You're not ill, your neighbor will come and cook for you. This is the Africa that I grew in. This is the Africa that I came to, way before me, my ancestors. But since the arrival of the Western civilization, everyone is greedy these days. And what did the African civilization left us? Exploitation and more hunger and dominance. So when you're talking about African civilization, to me, as an African person, when you're talking about Western civilization, to me, as an African person, I have my reservation. Yes, Western civilization has brought many, good things to humanity. The simple fact that we're talking now to each other, yes, but it's not just the Western civilization. Where those raw material are coming from? Were there basically like people involved in there that are not just white Westerns? We need to think about all those days before we start basically thinking that, I think Stephen said a civilization is better than the other. No, any civilization during its era is greatly important. But saying that the Western civilization is the best ever, I have my reservation for that. That's my introduction.
Very nice, very nice. Yeah, I was just gonna say, besides touching on all of that about like the trade-offs and about how it's quite ironic that we're having this discussion right now, like on a platform like Zoom, and it's American made, very Western, but even its founder, Eric Yuan, is like a Chinese-born American billionaire, someone who only came to the States before their 30s, having raised and being educated in China. With all that upbringing and culture, how could one claim, oh yeah, it's better here, that's why they came, while disregarding the influence and skills picked up in the East that made him able to strive higher than like 99% of the American populace. I guess then, with our current age, modernization, globalization, the cultural mixing and grooming, things become quite hard to disentangle. How would you then be able to kind of like separate these values out of themselves and draw a line to actually say that yes, these are all things from the West and not things that the West kind of exploited or gone through colonization, gotten through, pretty much ill means. Yeah, SJ, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to respond to everyone for this, but I think just starting with Lap, I think when he was talking about Western civilization, he was focusing too much on a specific part of that. So I feel like you were focusing almost entirely on Anglo-Saxon, ideas of democracy and
Liberalism,
capitalism and economics.
basically.
Yeah, exactly. But that's only a fraction of Western civilization. I mean, even Marxist systems, authoritarian systems have their roots within Western philosophy. And I think there's far more to a civilization than just, whether you have representative or direct democracy. There's far more to it than that. There's art, there's culture, there's music, there's literature, there's ways of life, fashion, and invention. In terms of some other points that was raised by Shams, when did Western civilization start? And I mean, there is no agreed consensus on that, but personally myself, I would sort of say the seeds were in ancient Greece, and that's where I think the foundations of what we understand as Western philosophy and Western civilization really started. And whilst it's true, I think you can say that Western civilization has more in the pros column, as I was saying before, than other civilizations. You were touching upon like each civilization has had its heyday. There were the great African civilizations, which you touched on, which is a completely true point, like the Malian Empire. There were great Islamic civilizations like the Caliphate. But I think if you bundle them all together, what Western civilization has achieved it's greater than those, even compared to their peaks and their heights. I do think it's not. I don't like the sort of end of history narrative that comes out of a lot of neoliberals, that the end of history is the countries naturally reach a sort of neoliberal system, and that's the end, and that's where they stop the development. I don't agree with that, and I do think other civilizations, such as what I would call the Sinic civilization, which is, you know, the Chinese civilization, would also include you know, Korea, even Singapore, Vietnam in that. I think they have yet to have their peak, and there is potential that, you know, they may contribute more to the world than Western civilization ultimately. But I think that where we are now, I'm trying to put this together in a coherent thought, but where we are now, Western civilization has contributed more to the world than where we are now. And I also just want to stress, though, and, you know, Asham's made a very valid point here about, you know, that other civilizations contribute to the world, and that's absolutely true. No civilization exists in isolation. I'm not trying to say that everything was done by the West. You know, great inventions contributed by the Islamic empires. Some of those Islamic empires were in Africa. You know, obviously China contributed quite a lot in inventions, both in ancient history, but now the country's developed and they're doing today. So I don't think it's a case of everything's done in isolation. We are a globalized world now, especially. But I think looking at the big picture, you could say Western civilization is, and I am uncomfortable with this word, but it is the question, Western civilization is superior. I think one more point before I hand over is just to set clarity. The question was, what are we comparing Western civilization to? So there is actually a really good book called The Clash of Civilizations. If you study international relations at university, it's one of the first sort of pieces of text thrown at you, which sort of sets the ground for conflict in the world following the Cold War. And the civilizations that define, I think it's, you know, it's the Western civilization, which is, you know, most of Europe and North America. You've got the Orthodox civilization, which is Russia and Russia's sort of sphere. And you can sort of see the clash of civilizations happening there now. Ukraine's sort of on the border. Are they part of the Western civilization? Are they in the Orthodox civilization? Got Islamic, African, Sinic, and Latin American, I think, the main ones. I might be missing a couple. Oh, Hindu, of course, with India. But that's generally what is defined as civilization within an international relations context.
Very nice. Okay, so I've gotten a sense like we've gone with that quite Greek Romans kind of civilizations, you know, period, where that's when we are beginning to start off with as a benchmark to how like Western civilization basically started. And I kind of like, I agree with you right there as well about, you know, how, you know, no culture, no civilization was, you know, had their own things in isolation. You know, like our modern number systems were invented by the Arabs in Saudi Arabia during the Middle Ages. Gunpowder was invented by the Chinese, modern guns by Europeans, so on and so forth. But okay, I guess that would be one of the things that we all could just agree on then. Like, you know, every culture has like their parts to play. And even if we can consider the West the best, it's not entirely all on their merits or all on their efforts. But okay, Shams, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much. Stephen, I really like what you're saying, but you see, I will start with your last point, and also you, Nick. Whenever there is a peer review, so that's one thing that I actually made a remark to Northumbria University. Whenever there is a book that I want to read, even like colonization, you know, I'm not going back to those things. Whenever a Western person writes a book, it's reviewed by, you know, Western academics. But I did not see any book from Africa talking about colonization from the African side. So again, when you're talking about, yes, there is a multitude of ways that we have to see a civilization. But don't forget that some of the civilization are being oppressed. For one civilization to be called the best, some has to be oppressed or not talked about. This is what I'm going in general. We were talking about, Asian civilization, but I dare any of you to name me one African civilization that you can come up with, or one African kingdom, that you know of, or empire even. You see, this is the kind of things. Always when we talk about civilization, they said it started with ancient Greece, but no, democracy or even like those debates originate in Africa, and especially in Nubia, which is modern day Sudan, and all the way to Ethiopia and Eritrea. Even religion, if you take it, I'm not going through the civilization, but even religion, when you take like Christianism, it was basically like developed in Africa before it expanded to Europe. But yet they don't talk about it often. One of the oldest Bible is actually in Eritrea, in Ethiopia. It was in Eritrea, but then now it's in Ethiopia. But you don't hear people talk about it. Again, civilizations of the Western society is really good. It's very good. But to whom is it benefiting? This is my question. I'm not basically saying that it's not good. No, to whom? That's my question. That's my issue with the Western civilization. There is always an a form of oppression for it to basically come to be.
Lamgong, do you have anything to respond to opposite? Lamgong, you there?
For example, you see, I mentioned you the Ming Dynasty, and apart from that, there is basically like the temples in Thailand that are still there. That shows a great civilization. While basically all the way until Middle Ages, they call it Dark Ages because Europe was still basically not knowing what civilization is until we have the Renaissance. But all that is completely not known for many people around the world, that during that time, there are kings in Africa that were going to, pilgrimage and making the price of gold collapse. There are many, many kingdoms that are in Asia that already by then were building their own temple. What about the Mayan civilization? They used to basically calculate the time way before anyone. That was basically something that nobody's doing that. They can tell you if it's going to rain, or basically tell you what time of the day it is, simply because they were ahead of their time. Yes, Western civilization at the moment is ahead of their time. And now we're seeing that China, continental Asia, is coming to be. It was Africa, then it switched to Europe, then it switched to America. And now, I tell you what, watch this space, is going to be continental Asia, mainly China, pushing forward with the microchip, the technology. Back in the days, the sundial with the Mayan or the Aztec is not, nobody knows how it works, but they managed to sort it out. So these are the kind of things that I want to talk in general. It's not just like a painting or debating philosophically, but yeah, every nation, every empire has got those. But during that time, they were at their peak. So let's not forget that.
Right, very nice. Yeah. I've seen a report that says, by 2050, China would be already overtaking US as the superpower in terms of GDP. And yes, SJ, go for it.
2050 is way more. I saw another review recently that was actually shown to me by the council leader that I was telling you. But that was basically shown to me to show that before 2050, latest 2030 or 2040, China will overtake, continental Asia will overtake the United States simply because of the microchip development. So every empire has got something. As you said, China was ahead. They invented the gunpowder. Western Europe, now they start using atomic bomb. They were ahead. And now we come to the microchip era. Every generation have those steps. So saying that, yeah, because they have philosophers, every what do you call it, civilization has philosophers, thinkers, debating, organized. But it takes something to make that civilization way ahead of every other civilization.
Yep, SJ, go for it.
Yeah, so I actually think that we're straying a bit too far from what is a civilization. This discussion is focusing too much on international relations and international relations theory, with a particular bias, as tends to happen in international relations, towards understanding powers through the projection of hard power. And while I think that these are valid points to make in regards to which will be the greatest superpower, in terms of wealth and military power, and definitely I see China as the next superpower. Of course, as Agent P probably won't be surprised to hear, I think that the rise of China is a good thing. I can feel, I can see that. I can imagine that Lap is horrified by that idea, but I think that, as I would define my international relations theory in sort of the terms of realism, and I think that a bipolar order is healthier than the unipolarity that we've seen of American Europe, Western civilization since the 90s. But I'm keen for this discussion. I'm actually going to counter you, Shams, because you said that you made the comment on not really wanting to talk about philosophy or art culture, but actually I'm keen for that to be included in this debate, because I don't like to see a civilization purely by its means to project hard power, but also its soft power, I think is incredibly important. And sure, the West has had hard power dominance since the 90s, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I think it also has, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was a soft power superpower. And this is not, and I'm also keen not to just see the West through the lens of Anglo-Saxons as well. Sure, America is a huge cultural powerhouse when it comes to things like music. But if you do it on a per capita basis, I believe actually Sweden is the leader in contributing to music. They write most of the songs that you hear in your day-to-day life. But I think in terms of philosophy, yes, there are philosophers from China, and I think China are the Sinic. You can't say China's China. The Sinic civilization is one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. Amazing cultural contributions, not just in terms of it's military power, but or its economic clout. And actually, if you look at a history, if you look at economic power, the natural state of the world is for China to be the #1 economic power. It's actually, if you take a longer view of the world, for the majority of time, China has been the #1 economic power. In fact, the hegemony of the West as an economic power is kind of a blip when you look at the whole picture. But it is also a cultural powerhouse. They have contributed to philosophy, Confucius thought, and so on. But what we're talking about here is which civilization is superior, or the best, or the greatest, or which has contributed the most to the world. And I still believe that is the West. So Agent P touched on our numbers are Arabic. Shams, you asked earlier, name African civilizations. I touched on one earlier, like the Mali civilization, which was one of the wealthiest empires that has ever existed. But I still think that Western thought, Western philosophy, Western culture, Western art has contributed the most, and has inputted the most to the world. And I just want to counter a point earlier as well, made by Shams. You were talking about the origins and how most things you can sort of really trace back the roots to Africa. And I would say a lot of that is a stretch. I've seen quite a bit of revisionism in that regard, especially mostly from African Americans. And while it's true, you could say, for instance, the potato has its origins in Central America. Would you say that dishes that contain potatoes in the West aren't Western dishes? I think, as I say, you don't want to see civilizations in isolation, but what the West has tended to do is, yes, it has imported some of these ideas. You did have democracy I'd have to look into that actually, but you did have you pointed out that there were democratic systems in Africa that predate ancient Egypt, but I think I'm not sure whether that spread to ancient Greece, but I think it was developed in isolation. But one thing the West tends to do is, I think, is take ideas and then perfect it. I mean, look at the global language that we're all using to communicate now. We're using English. It's a Western thing. We take things from the world and we perfect it. Yet, you touched on colonialization and oppression. All civilizations have had, oppression, have used things like slavery. It wasn't just the West that had slavery, but what the West has tended to have done is, perfected it, industrialized it. We unfortunately, we did that with colonialization. We built these huge global empires. We enslaved people, and that was terrible. We're not a perfect civilization. There's definitely a challenge to Western civilization, but on the whole, when you look at it compared to other civilizations, I think we have created the best so far. One of the evidences of that is, the world speaks English. It wears Western fashion. It almost an admiration of Western civilization, and so much so that Westernization is associated with a country progressing, with it developing, with it becoming modern. And I think for the time being, while lots of civilizations have potential, I would argue the science civilization has a lot of potential, and the natural order is that to dominate economically. So if China can sort of hack soft power, which it hasn't yet managed to do, it could, in 200, 300 years, we might look back and think differently on this discussion. Some people would say, the Hindu civilization has a lot of potential as well. So I don't think we're at the end of history, that some thinkers like Francis Fukuyama would argue. I do think where we are now, the West is, more in the pro column. So far, the best civilization we've experienced. It's the way Western ideas have spread globally, been the foundation of all different countries. Even China, the main threat that you might see to the West, it's built on Marxism. It's built on Western ideology, ultimately. Of course, it's adapted it, socialism with Chinese characteristics, but there's not really an equivalent. Confucianist thought hasn't penetrated Western ideology or Western philosophy or Western thought in the same way. So I'm still inclined to say it is, while all civilizations have contributed a lot and are great in their own right, the West has prevailed so far. How that changes is yet to be seen.
Very nice. Before I pass the time on to Shams to respond, Gong, do you want to say anything? You've been quite silent for a while. No? Okay. Anyway, I will just sort of add to what Stefan said before moving on. I think, yes, the West has also came up with a lot of great thought, great thinkers. There's a lot of philosophy that we see all around today. That the Enlightenment has brought up a lot of things and beliefs about morals and principles. It's also invented the scientific method. With that all being said, right, how would you be able to kind of justify the things that the West are still currently doing, even when we have like the science out there, which was, something that the West actually created, to really show the impacts of, I'm not a climate alarmist by any means, but like in terms of climate change, they have had the worst impact on the world. There's tons of greenhouse gases, global emissions, and we're still not listening to the science on that one. We're still progressing on with all of these things that, yes, you can say other civilizations are doing it too, especially China. But then if you look into the data of like how China's managing their carbon emissions, it's all coming from manufacturing things from the West itself. So yeah, how would you kind of like ponder those philosophies and be so enlightened, and yet at the same time continue on with allowing these things to happen to the world? When you speak about like slavery and all those systems, yes, you know, like the British Empire did end slavery, and also there are still slavery that's ongoing in the world, especially in the Middle East. You know, the millions that are still enslaved today. And to say that, you know, oh, yeah, you see, like, you know, other cultures are still having this kind of systems, but how much did the West actually impact those societies or those economies to kind of rely on slavery as a means of getting by? You know, had it not been from their expectations that these countries would be out of that today, would you consider that like, you know, a bit of like a hand waving thing, as sort of like a distraction? I don't know. I'm just putting out some questions back to you, and then before I let you respond again, I'm just gonna put it up to Shams to get his points out as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I just want to come back quickly on those issues. I think when we're talking about civilization, it's not just about philosophers or thinkers. You know, we also, again, we're talking about the whole cultural, you know, movement, such as anything to do with that civilization. It's not just the great thinkers. You have the military power, you have everything that include that civilization. And I really appreciate that you mentioned the Malia Empire, Stephen. Yes, it's probably one of the most known, but there are quite a few, which is really great. Again, my question earlier, I was in Northumbria University library. I was looking for a book, you know, peer reviewed by Africans on the negritude and also on the colonialism. I couldn't find any. All the books that I'm seeing is written by Western people, and none of them were even actually, you know, written by someone from Africa, the African perspective. Again, so when you tell me that you want people to have that kind of thing, how can we have that if we're not even including the thinking or the philosophy of people from other civilization? You know, a great civilization should not be enforced on people. People will adapt to it. That's the way I see it. Civilization shouldn't be enforced on people. That's my view. It's not something that is said, because whenever you enforce your civilization on people, then you're asking them to abandon their own civilization and adapt to yours. Yes, many people speak English around the world, but for some of us, it was imposed on us through the civilization, the Western civilization. You know, we have our own writings, we have our own language, but it was imposed to us to do that through the civilization. So it's not just about thinking. I know maybe you are a philosopher, you like that side better, but I'm looking for everything in general that is consist with a civilization. And Nick, I think you are totally right quickly when you talk about, you know, the slavery points. Many don't even know that actually right now in Arabia, when I say Arabia, Middle Eastern, slavery still exists even among themselves. Even in Africa, it does exist. And yes, Stephen, you touch on the point that, it was industrialized by the West, which was basically corrected again by the British. Again, you see, that's great thinkers. Now your philosophy is coming due to the Quakers, which was founded of one of my town here, Joseph Pease. He's a Quaker. He actually is an abolitionist, you know. That was good. I like those kind of thinking, you know, philosophy. But again, at what cost through that civilization? Because they have to pay reparation. Well, not reparation, but they have to pay, you know, the slave owners, but they didn't pay the slave up till now. You see? So again, that's basically a little bit unbalanced. Whenever we're talking about those kind of things, I kind of like think personally that when you talk about civilization, don't just think about the great thinkers or the great philosophers. It's the whole thing in the society, in that civilization, that we have to examine under the scope. And then we can make sure that it's right. For example, during the COVID, as recent, I can hear you, you know, you're saying, yes, that's true. But Britain and most countries, they have that, the vaccine. They were going going to basically make it available as a great civilization, Western civilization. China was ready, Russia was ready, but yet Britain and that, they wouldn't let us basically, they wouldn't sell the patent because they said, yeah, we put our money and effort in that. Yeah, that's fine. Again, the Western civilization has created something in the 21st century that I don't really like. I'm sorry to say this. When it comes to the International Monetary Fund that was funded, how come Western countries are the only one borrowing money with very low interest, but countries like in Africa, Niger, if they want to borrow, we have to go through France that still have a colonial. See, that's the civilization of the West. It's colonial currency used when France itself is not using its own currency. So I would like to think about the thinkers, the philosophers, but when it comes to civilization, I am having to take it under all the scopes. Thank you.
SJ, go for it.
Yeah, I think you both raised a lot of points, and I'm trying to make notes as we go along in this conversation, and I really want to address them all, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can and address all of these. So I think if I start with you, Agent P, and your comments, I think your first one was on the regards to the environment and how you could argue that Western civilization has, destroyed the planet potentially through climate change and industrialization. And I think I would say that my thoughts on that is, in a way, and I hope that I don't outrage everyone on this call by saying this, but I think it's the case of West was a victim of its own success. And what I mean by that is we just got there first. We started industrializing first before the seeds of, ideas of environmentalism and sustainability really caught on. And I'm not convinced that if the West didn't excel so much in the 18 and 1900s, I'm not convinced that if any other civilization did that, whether it was Orthodox, whether it was African, whether it was Islamic, whichever civilization would industrialize first, that they would have done things differently. I think if the Islamic civilization was the first to industrialization, that they would have harmed the planet just as much as the West did. I think the problem is that we were first. But obviously, destroying the a terrible thing, but I do feel as well, actually, this is one thing where I do dislike the way how the West approaches a lot of the world, is we do kind of patronize it, and we do tell developing countries, no, you can't cut down your forest to develop, which is a bit hypocritical because we did it in order to develop ourselves. But I would sort of jump to the defense in the West, and as I say, as a victim of our own success, we were there first. So we destroyed the planet before we found out about things like climate change.
I agree with you on that one. Sorry to interrupt. Definitely, if Africa was there, they would have done the same. Just so that really great thinking. I do not condemn when people blame the West on global warming. Any civilization who was there will basically do the same. Sorry about that. Carry on.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so so I do kind of push back on that a little bit. I think let me just have a look at my notes. Sorry. So yeah, I think one thing as well that we were talking about was sort of slavery and how slavery props up the West, and this is definitely true. I mean, you could look at the fast fashion industry for this. I mean, not exclusively fast fashion, but I think they're one of the more notable examples of this, and how they essentially use slavery to get you your £5 t-shirts. I would say that is a civilizational problem, but it's only part of Western civilization, because I think the answer to that still comes from Western civilization. So there's overlaps a little bit with what Sham said as well. But capitalism and global capitalism, which I think needs slavery to survive. Lap would probably definitely disagree with me in that as a libertarian, but I think capitalism cannot exist without slavery. I think that this is a different debate. This is, how capitalism needs an oppressed international class, slave class, to sustain the quality of life that we have in the West. And that is an ill, and has come from Western civilization. And as I say, when I approached this, when I was thinking about this topic before we joined the call, I was making essentially pro and con list. And the con for me from Western civilization's contribution to the world is this oppressive global capitalist system, which has created slavery. And you made a comment, Nick, that I noted down here. You were like, when British people say, oh, but we abolished slavery, is that hand waving? Yes, and it infuriates me when I talk to other British people and they say, oh, but we abolished slavery. Or, oh, the British Empire built railroads. And it infuriates me because I think if you were to isolate the British Empire, I would say that, sure, there are the definite pros. We built infrastructure, although more to our benefit than the locals' benefit. We contribute to the English language, which maybe I'm a little biased. I think it's, one of the greatest languages created, and that's part of the reason why it's become a global lingua franca. But I think overall the British Empire was evil, and I wish more British people would reflect on it in that way. Just to briefly get more to the points that Shams was raising, wanting to focus more on hard power, military.
Yeah, on the British Empire, I think it was really something good come out of it because we have the Industrial Revolution. Don't get me wrong. I do appreciate not the empire, but the ideology, the thinking, the philosophy that was under behind those things. I really like them very much. So I just don't want us to pass and then bring it back. So continue.
Yeah, actually, I think I would say they're very intertwined as well. I would actually say I lean more to the idea that industrialization enabled the empire to reach the extent it did. But Britain, we were talking earlier about the West being the first to industrialize. Britain was the first to industrialize within the West, which I think they gave us an advantage on the global scene. But sorry, yeah, where was I going? Oh yeah, Shams were talking about hard power. Wanting to focus more on hard power, military hegemony. I think that sadly, one measure of what is a successful civilization is its ability to force others to adopt its way of life, its thinking, and its culture. And we have to zoom in a little bit here. So I'm going to focus on this particular civilization within Western civilization. So if you look at we're going quite far back here, and I'm sorry to do this because I did want to focus more on contemporary politics, but if we look at the Roman Empire, part of the reason for its success was just how violent it was and how it was able to do military conquest and very aggressively compared to its neighbors. There's an excellent little short documentary on this, which I can find. But for its time, it just didn't stop conquering its neighbors. It started with the Italian peninsula, then Carthage in North Africa, and then spreading throughout the majority of the European continent. And one of the reasons for its success was, it could militarily take over these countries and destroy them. And it was ingenious in how it stole, we were talking about origins, how it stole ideas from different civilizations, integrated them into its own military. If we want to do a clash of civilizations, looking at Carthage, a Middle Eastern North African empire, when Rome first went to war with Carthage, it didn't really have a navy, it didn't have naval power. It actually found a shipwrecked Carthaginian boat and copied the plans for the boat, and then built its own navy that rivaled Carthage in like 3 months. It was excellent at absorbing ideas and molding it. But then when it conquered powers, it didn't just absorb them and rule them, from top down. It convinced the citizens to this idea of Roman civilization. People in France conquered territory of the Roman Empire, saw themselves as Roman citizens, who adopt the language, the idea of system of governance. And I think you can zoom out with that idea and look at it on a civilization perspective. What the West is great at, which I think is necessary for a civilization to survive, it's great at taking over. Yeah, yes, militarily we can do that, and we have done that. Colonization in the past. In modern days, I think you can quite easily argue that NATO, basically an instrument of the West, is the militaristic hegemon. But also culturally, people want to be Western, and I think there's a degree of forcing people to accept your culture as Rome did, but it's also people are now actively wanting to be more Western. People in, if I think of most of what I'm going to refer to is Cynic, because that's where the focus of where my studies is. But the people in China have been adopting Western ideas, wanting to appear more Western, wanting to drink French wine, wear Western brands, really look up to Western luxury brands, want to appear more American, want to adopt more American culture. You can see that in Chinese music, how it's moved from sort of the ballads that the baby boomers are interested in, and you're starting to see things like Chinese drill, Chinese rap, all part of Western culture. Look at K-pop. That is a Western culture, the idea of pop music, and they've put their own spin on it, sure, but it's part of Western civilization. And I think you can say that the West being hegemonic is a bad thing, but I think the fact that we are so hegemonic is testament to us being one of the great empires, because unfortunately, peaceful civilizations don't thrive. A peaceful civilization gets conquered. Militaristically is sure one way, but also culturally. And when it does survive, you look at things like very peaceful forms of Buddhism and so on. What happens is these dominant civilizations like the West come in, take them and completely bastardize them. You have white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who have taken Buddhist thought and turned it into New Ageism, which has spread like wildfire. I think it is sadly these negatives that you're talking about, colonization, hegemony, both culturally and military, they're just features of a successful civilization. And as horrible as they are, they just show they just show that the West is dominant and the most successful. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm repeating myself now. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I really want to touch on that quickly before we move on. Apologies. I like the fact that you said, those are the kind like successful civilization, which is true. One thing is for sure. For example, during the Berlin Conference at the end of the 19th century, I think Europeans said they're going to bring civilization to Africa. Again, sorry if because you just mentioned that. Is that right? That's the main goal of colonization of those African countries, European countries, scatter the countries between themselves. So then we have our independence. The thing that I'm trying to say here is, if you take like countries like Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, right? Most of them, basically, they were colonized as well, but they get their independence. They civilize them, because let's be honest, colonization is just a racist way of saying, we think we're superior than you. So they colonized us, they gave us the civilization, then they gave us back the land, and all those countries are prospering. Can you name one country in Africa that is prospering since the end of this colonization in Africa? So that's again where my point is going. There is a little bit of no, I wouldn't say racism, but it's really a hidden agenda in those civilizations that we're being taught. We are taught, you're right, we are taught there is no civilization that can happen without empowerment, without empowering, the other civilization. Yes, every civilization is done since the dawn of time. Even Mayans did it, Aztec did it, you take it, most of the nations, civilization did it. Sorry, because I'm a French spoken, so I tend to put some French words in there. But the most important thing is, once we are civilized, why did we not attain the top civilization that we needed? For like other countries, we have the raw materials in our countries, but yet we did not. So this is why I'm basically skeptical about the Western civilization. Yes, there is no doubt it's the greatest, but I'm asking my question, to whom? This is the thing. To whom? Are we benefiting from? Yeah.
So
but the last thing also is, when you take, sorry about that. The last thing is also when you take like the countries, even within former colonies, when we're talking about colonialism, English former colonies, they all have their own money. But in Africa, still today, most African French colonies are under the same currency since the colonial time, since the brutal civilization.
Mm-hmm. So I think what I really want to do there is connect both those thoughts that you have. You talked about, and you have to be patient with me here because Africa is nowhere near my expertise. I focus almost entirely on East Asian politics and my time at school. But you talk about colonization being over, African countries getting their independence, but not thriving in the same way that former British colonies such as Singapore or the white Commonwealth countries, Australia and Canada, have thrived. And then you touched on at the end there about how French African countries still using the same currency. And I was vaguely aware of that. I think there is a francs or something using it's kind of tied to the French currency. I'm not entirely sure how it works.
Yeah,
but
it's the colonial, basically Communauté Française, colonial franc that we use. You're right. Yeah.
I have heard of this. Yes. Please be patient. I'm not an expert. What I would just like to do is connect those two thoughts and just say, my view of the world and the way how it exists is that the colonization and oppression of Africa hasn't ended. So yes, you have your nationhood independence in Africa, which, by the way, is a very Western concept. The concept of a nation state, of having a flag. And one point that I like to make when I have these conversations is listen to the national anthems of African countries. Even listen to the national anthem of Singapore. Is that music what you would associate with that civilization and culture? No, it's usually a sort of Western classical music and tune. I mean, I can't think of one on the top of my head for Africa, but when I think of, like you see in Asian countries, a lot of them have orchestral music. The exception is China, which is it's a war song from the war with China. But and the idea of having a flag, a nation state, all very Western ideas that we've imposed on you. But despite you having a nation state, despite you having a flag, despite you having a very non-African national anthem, I don't think that the oppression of your country has ended. And I think that African countries are essentially colonized, essentially oppressed, exploited by not just Western civilization, but let's be honest, mainly through the system of global capitalism. So I would say it's not ending. You touched on you going to the library and not being able to find African academics, and I'm sure they exist, and I'm sure they're trying to contribute to academia, but that is because of the oppression of your civilization by primarily, but not exclusively, Western civilization. And unfortunately, that thing that's happening, that just to be clear, I don't agree with these things. That's happening because of the supremacy and hegemony of Western civilization. And that is by its nature one of the things, sadly, that makes it great. And you ask a brilliant question, which I loved, which is great for who? Superior for who? And obviously civilizations look after their own. So, it's good for, as I think the only white person on this call, white Westerner on this call, it's good for me. It's good for the white Westerners. But if I can do a circle to sort of what I was saying at the start of the call, I do think that, Western civilization has contributed many greats to the world that we use every day, that we think every day, that builds our world and our world structures, that no other similar civilization has yet done. Yeah, I think I just the point. I just wanted to connect that the start of what you were saying and the end of what you're saying is, I don't think colonization as oppression is ended, but sadly that is the future of the African civilization being oppressed by, quote unquote, a superior, greater civilization.
All right. I know you're right, Stephen. Thank you very much. That's exactly the two dots that I was connecting. So I was trying to basically say that we have the civilization, but we still basically feeling oppressed. But I'm glad that you mentioned that. So yes, the Western civilization is really great in this era. And let's not forget the contribution as well, like I was saying. We had the Industrial Revolution, right? We also have the expectancy of life that is basically prolonged, even in Africa, not just for the West, even in Africa. And whenever there is a crisis, they help. But also, yes, every civilization is kind of like, you have to look after yourself first. Yeah, of course. That goes without saying, it's the ideology of basically me first, and then the rest we will see. That's fine, I understand that. The point that I wanted to also make is, we Africans, again, I'm going back to the African point. I know we're supposed to include Asia, because there are some Asia's countries. We had recently last year, as I'm doing international relations, politics and diplomacy, we have our discussion about, is China becoming a hegemon in Africa? I was lucky enough, sorry, this is just in bracket, to have one of the German foreign office, diplomatic in Kenya, we were talking. But yes, you're right, because I asked to him, I said, do you know why Jomo Kenyatta, one of the founding father in Kenya, started writing in his native language? Because he said, I'm basically taking the English language and I'm not even being peer reviewed. Maybe if I write in my own language, then my people will peer review that. So you're right, there are some. But when it comes to colonialism, when it comes to denouncing what has happened during the great civilization that was brought to us, we do not have a say. And for me, that is a problem. Sorry if I circle back. There are some books, but when it comes to negritude, which is basically the era when, I'm not going to be concurrent, when most African writers start writing, like Leopold Sédar Senghor, the French Senegalese, he's from Senegal, they start writing. So all those are not basically being published enough in libraries or being taught. But I can understand that. Again, this is a civilization that has to show how good it is for many people, but that cannot be done. Again, it's the Africans' problem, Africans' fault for not doing the same like China has done. This is what I'm going, or like Russia have done. They kept their language, they kept everything, but they still, like you said, K-pop, they're adapting to K-pop, but they kept the culture. We are losing our culture. We can benefit from the Western civilization and make it, it's a great one, but we are not being able to. And that's because we're still not basically free to enjoy the Western civilization. So I cannot say it's the greatest for a civilization that personally, me and my peers are not enjoying. Because even democracy, our leaders are selected. You have democracy, our leaders somehow, even here in UK, you have the Tory 300 and something thousand selected, a leader to lead the United Kingdom for what, we are 60 million now or 70 million people. So again, in Africa, we have that to be chosen by the West for us. And that is going with, you heard recently a coup that happened in Burkina Faso in January. And then yesterday, another coup happened. That's because the person who did the coup d'etat was basically going against France. He wants to make a new alliance with Russia. And then France do not accept with that. But you don't hear those in the media. So we are not entitled to enjoy the Western civilization. Like, we can choose, but there is also, they say, oh, there is a fraud, or there is a vote that is not going. That is not democracy for us. That's part of the civilization we're not enjoying. So that's just to introduce the democracy part in this discussion. I hope you understand.
No, yeah, I totally understand, and I do think that, you know, just circling back to your point of good for who, like, you know, the supremacy of Western civilization is primarily good for Westerners, and the majority of Africans are victims of Western civilization. I think one thing I just want to touch on that you brought up is you know, talking about the role of China in Africa and neo-imperialism. I think one thing that I like to bring up when people mention this is I remember reading about an African politician. I'm sorry, I can't say which one. I think it might have been from the BP. He commented that, you know, when Western leaders or Western investors come to his country, he gets he gets left behind feeling belittled and patronized. But after the China delegation visits the country, they usually leave behind a hospital and a school. So I think I would say that while there are definitely what you could say imperial, I'm not sure if I like the term imperial for this, but there's definitely sort of a culturally hegemonic reasons behind China's involvement in Africa. And you can see that through the use of Confucius Institutes, pushing quite hard for particularly East Africans to learn Mandarin in schools.
Yes, yes.
So, you know, you touched on language earlier. China wants to have a lot of soft
Do you know
power.
that? Yes. Do you know that, sorry to interrupt you, Stephen, the new headquarters of the African Union was built by China as a present. So just between us, it's just a presumption. Do you know how many listening devices can be put in that building? You know, I'm sure it's not, they're saying, you see, that's another thing, beauty of civilization. They build a building, but again, they leave it behind. But when we have, that's exactly what I said to, you know, the German diplomat. I said to him, look, if the Western civilization was good to us, we will never, ever let China or Russia come in Africa. But if you belittle us, you're not basically looking after our needs or let us be independent, as you said we should be. Then if you treat us as basically trade partners, we will be happy to adopt your civilization, even basically give some of our cultures. But if you are not making us happy, then of course, it's only a human nature that we will say to someone who will make us feel better. This is what I explained to him. If China is becoming a hegemon in Africa now, it's because of the Western civilization's fault. And I will explain this to you in clearly ways, because you just mentioned earlier the beauty of it. For example, we have a river that is exploiting uranium in Niger. And they were actually going to build, a river is a form of EDF. Basically, French EDF is part of a river. They mine the uranium and they create your central nuclear that was, I think 20 billion is going to be built recently. So in general, Niger has got no central nuclear at all. Electricity power cut is basically crippling hospitals and everything. And Niger is one of the hottest countries on earth you can think of, which basically means even now we might be 45 degrees Celsius. So how come a country that is basically exploiting uranium and coal to power Western central nuclears or charcoal nuclear electricity power generators is still basically don't have a railway system, Stephen, a railway system. See, so China will come, they will build a stadium or they will build a railway, they will take what they want. But this is what I'm saying. The civilization is really great, but the West needs to rethink again that the way they used to colonize people is not going to work anymore because people are awakened. You know, they have awakened the taste for people's eyes and people will not basically going to be silent. They know what good life tastes like or feels like, you cannot basically, the genie is out, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. That's my expression. That's as simple as I can put it. I hope you understand.
No, I do totally, and I also think that the West is stuck in its old ways, and doesn't quite know how to approach African civilization now. But yeah, I do think that Chinese involvement in Africa, you know, while there are questions about it, and I'm not really a fan of conspiracies such as you know, hidden microphones and in parliamentary buildings. I'm not sure how much grounded in truth that is, but I do think that China is.
No, that's just me basically saying hypothetically, but you know, somebody build you a building and say, take the building. Obviously, come on, Stephen. I'm pretty sure there is something attached to it. That's just a human nature thing. You know, I'm thinking as a human, you know. Somebody build a house and say, oh, take the house, Stephen. It's just me being kind to you. How often do that happen? How often?
Yeah, so I don't think China is just doing this out of the good of its heart. Obviously, it wants stuff in
That's
return.
it. Thank you. That's exactly what I mean to say.
The point I was more getting at is that I don't think you can equate Chinese hegemony. I don't think it quite has hegemony yet in Africa, but Chinese attempts of influence in Africa is quite the same as how the West approaches Africa. I guess one thing, just to steer the conversation back to great civilizations and away from a specific instance of colonization, if I can. I think one thing you touch on, and this is why I want to take your point and leave with this, is the West not quite sure how to deal with its international relations and how to approach countries. And I do think, and this is perhaps controversial to a lot of American in particular thinkers, or those on the Western right, but I do think the West is a civilization in decline. You know, I think that whilst it is the greatest civilization that we've seen so far, I do think the West broadly is declining and being challenged by what I would call Sinic civilizations. So I wouldn't just solely put that on China, but also other East Asian civilizations, such as the Korean civilization and the Vietnamese civilization and so on. I think that them as a collective pose a threat to Western hegemony. And you can see how China is trying to convert its hard power into soft power. You know, look at the, if I can just move away a bit from, I think we've covered hard power. If I can move back to soft power a little bit in culture, you can see how China, in the context of Africa, trying to spread the Chinese language, but also if you look at how Chinese influence in filmmaking, you know, China is converting its hard, raw economic power to influence the soft power of the West, getting Hollywood movies to film in China, to, you know, have Chinese elements in the film, Chinese lead actors. You know, you're starting to see improved representation of Asians in Western media. You know, the Western man has gone in film has gone from a very feminized, weak, sneaky, tricksy, that's the word I call it, tricksy character in films, to, you know, you're starting to see strong Asian male leads. Asian women have gone from being incredibly sexualized, and they're now starting to be empowered in Western cinema. And I think this is all an influence of the rise of China as the West adapts its culture in order to sell to its markets. I would say that, yeah, you know, I think I mentioned earlier that if you look at the timeline of human history, China has almost always been the #1 economic power. It's a blip in history that the West has dominated economically, and I think that's the natural order of the world that we're going to return to at some point soon. I guess the question is, how successful is China going to be in converting its converting that raw hard power into soft power? And I think while it has started to improve on that, you know, Chinese language is a growing language. Will it replace English as the international language? I don't think so. even when China is the #1 power, are we all suddenly going to start listening to Chinese music? And whilst there's always going to be niche communities that, love K-pop or love Chinese rap, is it going to replace the music hegemons of Northern Europe, of Scandinavia and the American music industry? In our lifetimes, at least, even beyond that, the foreseeable, I don't see that. I think that, we can debate hard power all we like, but I still think, Western culture is here to stay for many more generations, and I think that's one of the things that has contributed to the world as a net good.
If
Go
I
on,
may,
feel-
Jay, like Karim, I've just been quite silent because I was just loving the conversation between you and Shams. It was just really nice to let it flow. I was learning a lot of stuff. I think Lapgong has picked up a lot of stuff too, so much so that his mind has exploded and it's probably left off the call now or something. But I'd like to steer back a bit of the points that you were making, especially the whole first country argument, which I feel like it's a bit of a red herring, just to be let off scot-free. It's a bit of a cop out of saying that, like it's kind of using like a what if argument mixed in with like a random truism that would get me to agree, right? Like this is like saying, well, actually, if colonizers didn't invade Africa, they would probably be the best superpower now. They are filled with minerals, spices, and raw materials, right? Which is undeniably true, but like that wasn't at the heart of what I was promoting, I guess. And I guess also like to add on to the points that were raised, right? Just to steer the conversation a bit back. Like right now, even with the knowledge of climate change and environmentalism, they still put corporate interests first to West. Capitalism basically is the reason why, Shell and ExxonMobil have been known to cover up the damages of their operations, or even go as far to spread disinformation years after they know through the science already that, how fossil fuels were shitty for the world, how these leaders act. Look at Boris Johnson, look at Liz Truss, Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, how in the UK, especially when I've came for the first few years and then really understand how these politicians were actually just sluts for big corporations and corporate interests, how they actually, the democracy that actually exists in the UK, it's actually kind of like legalized corruption in a sense. How they're just voted in, they're legalized to pollute the global north, and just because they're voted in with like the shining spectre or the label of democracy, that makes it okay. Do you not see that like at the same time, this whole like Western idea of like materialism, you mentioned like fast fashion, and then again with like my critique on how energy companies are raping the world and polluting like lower developed countries, that the whole Western idea of democracy, which came from the Greeks, like enables or legalizes this totally immoral acts. Like, yes, the West is the best, but only if you consider the best at like speed running everything, slavery, ending slavery, civil rights, gay rights, and not falling birth rates. Will we see the fall of the West soon? Relying on African and Asian bodies through immigration. Like you've also mentioned, like, not just in the West, but globally, it has added a lot of value to the world. And I would kind of dig deeper and like ask, like, in terms of like, if we to look at jobs, for instance, most CEOs, most middle management aren't actually coming from any of these other countries that are in the West itself. We just really just import, or we just have heavy immigration on jobs that people in the UK don't want to do. Like you look at the builders, you look at the cleaners, most of them are from the Black Asian minority ethnicity. And so like, what's next? Speed running the end of the world, is that what we would consider the best civilization? I know you also touched on like music, like how it has become like sort of a global hegemony, in a sense of how like the West has influences everywhere. But I wouldn't be so sure, so confident about that, because like if you look at jazz and rock, those like so-called Western sorts of forms of music were actually coming from the Black artists, which they kind of stole from. Like you look at Elvis Presley, for instance, right? And how he stole from many Black artists that came before him. And also you mentioned K-pop. Yes, that is actually quite a big one as well. You know, how they are actually westernizing themselves and their culture. And how you mentioned like that was a mark of like, you know, a great civilization, which I guess then the question comes to like, you know, for who and for what? And like, would you consider them, you know, practicing, you know, 6 hours a day to the point of exhaustion just to be looked at like a certain lens in the Western sphere, more like in sort of like a superior, or like of how they're kind of using like lighting or like lightening creams to appear more white, in a way they sound or speak. Like what good of these Western influences actually bring to society? What, like, yes, they are there, we acknowledge that they are there in some form or another, but like what good of them being there is there actually to talk about? Go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to hog all the time, but I feel like most of that was was aimed at me. So let me just work with that. Let me just work backwards, actually. So I'm going to start with the end of your point there, on terms of, you know, are these cultural soft power influences such as music a good thing? You're talking about the K-pop industry, which is crazy. You know, I'm not really a fan of K-pop, but I have read all about it, and there are a couple of songs that I find catchy. So I have looked into it, and then these big Korean corporations who, you know, control what they eat, how they look, all that. I think one thing that I want to stress here is I don't think a good civilization is measured by how benevolent it is. I don't think you can say that a civilization is superior because it exclusively spreads good. You know, I think we all agree that the Western civilization has contributed good and bad, but some of those bad things are what makes it great. That probably sounds bad, but what I mean is, you know, civilization as a unit, if you try to, I mean, it's hard. I can't think, you can't really have a Western civilization isn't a coherent unit. You know, it's made up of multiple parts. You know, you have the Anglo-Saxon part of it, you have the Gallic part of it, the Roman, the Greek, even the Eastern European, different components in it. But as I touched on earlier with using the example of Rome and Carthage, you know, one thing that makes a civilization great is its ability to absorb and get people to live in its way, and follow its way of life, and follow its ideas, and follow its philosophy, and all of that. And so the fact that, you know, these Koreans are going through this and doing ultimately quite a Western thing is testament to the greatness as a concept of being great as opposed to being good, of the Western civilization. Continuing with your points, following backwards, you know, you touched on some of the great music that we have in the world, such as jazz and rap, and the rock and roll, and how it has its origins within Black communities in America. You know, why I say to that is that's Western. Jazz, rap, rock and roll is Western. African Americans are Western. They follow Western culture. These, of course, origins in Africa, obviously racial, but we're not talking about which race.
That's sorry for controlling, checking quickly, Stephen. No, it's the other way around, I think. Western copy those because we still have, even if you take, for example, the Afrobeat, you know, people were twerking recently, but in Africa, people have been twerking in many generations. You know, they only started twerking in the year 2000. So, sorry, just basically a quick jump in before I forget that one. I think most of the rhythm was basically from African origin. And most of them were introduced in the West through slavery, like the gospel. Before, people don't basically even sing in churches and all that, but Black Americans stopped doing so.
Yeah. So I completely recognize things like Afrobeats and stuff, and music has origins within African music. Well, perhaps I communicated myself wrong there. What I meant to say is that I see, I'm not defining a civilization by its race. So I see Black people who, born and raised within Britain, within America, they are, especially African Americans, actually, I would say, overwhelmingly follow Western culture. And I mean, this is me talking as a white British person. And, you might have a different feeling to this, but my feeling is, if you were to pluck an African American off the street of the USA and put him down in Africa, he wouldn't be culturally integrated.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
So he follows Western culture. He is part, he may be black, but he is part of Western civilization. Let me just use an African American artist in the USA. Let's talk about Kanye. I would see Kanye as a Westerner. He is from Western civilization. The music he makes, yes, you can trace a lineage. You can follow the journey of this music and how it has origins in African music from Africa. But these things like jazz and rap were made by African Americans in the West who largely followed Western culture. So that's why I would say that jazz and rap and grime here in the UK, whilst it's led by Black people, it is part of Western culture because these people are Westerners. Sure, I'm really keen not to see civilization, not to confuse civilization and race. You can go.
Yes.
I keep banging on about the Roman Empire. Sorry. Yeah.
Quickly with that, before you jump to the Roman. So you see, I think basically the civilization started in Africa. Then it was brought, the Westerners developed it, or change it. Just because you take something and change it, it doesn't basically mean that it's your civilization. So most of those, I totally understand. Many of, even me now, when I'm talking or when I'm speaking to people back home, they say to me, "You're lost. You're not one of us." See, forget about those who were born here or Kanye West or things like that. Totally, you're right. I do not want to mix race to civilization. Anyone within the area of that civilization is basically part of that civilization. But again, taking something, we're talking about cultural appropriation. For example, when you take British people dressing as geishas, that's the same thing. I don't mind it. Or white people blackening their faces. They say, "Oh yeah, that's wrong. It's not cool." No, if anything, they're trying to adapt my civilization. That's fine. They're not doing anything. They're only learning. But if you do that to mock me, then we have a problem. But if you're doing that for cultural, understanding, that's fine by me. You see, that's the difference. So you can have something from a different culture, change it or make it better. That's fine. But would you say that basically is your civilization, or that belong to that person's civilization? Like the example of a geisha.
Yeah.
The Romans. Yeah, the Romans.
I'll avoid going back to Rome because I keep doing that. So I'm going to avoid doing that. But what I would say is though, I think maybe saying civilization makes it confusing. Would you say jazz is American, or would you say it's Nigerian, for instance? The answer is jazz is American, and so it was made by Africans and African Americans, and so people can trace the lineage back. You're talking about how a lot of culture and basically everything you can sort of trace back comes to Africa. Of course, that's because where the human species is from, Africa. You can always trace everything back to Africa. And you're talking about cultural appropriation. I think the example that immediately popped to my head is, would you say French fries are French? Or because they're made from potatoes, they're from the Incan civilization? No, you would say French fries are quintessentially a Western dish just because the potato has its origins within Central America. And sorry, this example is quite cheesy, but you know, just because it has some roots that you can trace back to the African continent, I think that doesn't make jazz, rap in the US or grime in the UK a part of, you know, African culture. I would say it's still Western culture, just made by people who can trace their lineage to Africa. I mean, talking about America is difficult because, you know, America, who will always dominate a conversation about Western culture because they are the hegemon of a hegemon. You know, the Western is a hegemony, but the America is the hegemony within the West.
America is way
they're only like 300 years old. You know, so is anything American? You know, unless we start talking about Native Americans, sadly, I would say the civilization not really existing anymore because of the white genocide. But you know, I would hesitate to go down that route. You know, a lot of people of Britain. Sorry, if I can just finish this point. A lot of people in Britain say, for instance, "Oh well, the Queen's German." No, she's not. Like, yeah, she has German family roots, but the Queen was, you know, British. So I'm very hesitant to follow this line of thought that jazz and rap is part of African civilization. I disagree with that. I think that is part of Western civilization, contributed by non-white people, sure, but it is an American thing, and America is part of Western civilization. I think African Americans are just as much part of Western civilization as myself. Sure, I can perhaps trace my ancestry further back in the UK, but I think African American culture is part of Western culture and Western civilization. And just before I hand over the floor, and I'm sorry, I do feel like I'm dominating this. Just before I hand over, I just really want to address all of Agent's piece points that he made across. He was talking about the environment and fast fashion and slavery and how that's a world evil, Western civilizations to join the world. And I would say, I would say that is capitalism, which of course is part of Western civilization, and it is definitely a negative. It's a horrible thing, and you do need an international proletariat, an international slave class to sustain capitalism. But and it's horrible. But I don't think that counters the fact that Western civilization is the greatest civilization that we've seen so far, and that's just part of its hegemony. As I keep hammering, benevolent, peaceful civilizations don't become great hegemons or great powers. They erase themselves from existence. So I think that's everything. I'm going to hand over the floor now to some other people.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's good. I just want to agree that, you know, when someone, like you were given the idea of grimes and that, yeah, they're totally UK, you know, or jazz is totally American. But blues that derive jazz that derive from blues, you know, it was being played in Africa many years with traditional instruments. And if I might say, that the same kind of instrument, like the violin and all that, that has been modernized and being played in America. So would you basically forget about the roots and talk about how it is? You know, like, so let's forget about that it derived from Africa, or, you know, like you said, I hate it when people actually say that the Queen is from Germany. No, she's not. She's from England. You know, a Black person who's born in the UK is not African. They have nothing to do with Africa. They don't know Africa at all. You know, I myself, I can try myself, I can say to me myself, I'm African, but we should not forget the roots. For example, during the Black Lives Matter protest, they were saying, yeah, they're taking down our statues, we have historical things, and these are important people. I said, yes, it's part of your civilization. But also, let's not forget that that person is now in a cosmopolitan society. The way that you used to see that person is not the same way that somebody else will see them. So at least write something next to their plaque of every great things they did. Also say something that they did for the other people that they don't feel left out. So for me, in a civilization, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just about the race. Nobody should be left out. If you have a civilization, everyone should benefit of it. This is my concept of civilization. I'm glad that you mentioned earlier that you say capitalism is basically the root of the Western civilization. And that, I think, is going to be the downfall of it. We have seen it come close to during the financial crisis in 2008, and even during the pandemic. African countries were not that much hurt by that, but yet we were hurt, not compared to those kind of things that were happening to the West. So the capitalism is definitely the roots of the Western civilization, and it's going to be basically painful for them to compete with the Chinese rising. As you said, cultural and everything. In Africa now, you have Africans that are learning Mandarin, and Cantonese. Believe it or not, I know for a fact. And then not just that, you have many Chinese that are going to settle in Africa, and the soft colonialism that you talk about, this is what is happening. You're right, Steve. It's really a soft, colonialism. But until when? Until when? Of course, during the colonialism time, or during the, the missionary era in Africa, the Westerns, they basically go brutally, kill everything and that. But the Chinese are presenting themselves as soft and nice people. But until when? That's another question that I've always asked my fellow African people. Should we not basically learn from our mistake in the past? Until when are we going to basically come to it? Because one way or another, China is going to basically overtake the West as a hegemon. I know that for sure. As you say again, in our lifetime, I don't know. But whatever that happened, what would that be for Africans? My main question. Already we have seen what is happening in the South China Sea. Whatever happening, China will basically boost up its military, and that's it. America can say anything, NATO can say anything, that is gone. But how far will China still going to be that soft power? How far, how long?
Yeah, I love and completely agree with your point that capitalism will be the downfall of the West. I do think capitalism is a unsustainable model on which to base your economics and your society. And there's a phrase that goes around online of late stage capitalism. It's almost like as a culture, millennials and generation Z have accepted that capitalism is in its final stages, and it's become sort of I forgot the word now. A dystopian, let's say, kind of a dystopian in its way of how it's morphing, and that we are in decline because of it. But what I'd say to that, just to focus on civilization, is the answer to this. Capitalism is but many ideologies that Western civilization has pushed upon the world. The counter to that, or at least the traditional counter to capitalism and Marxism, is also I mean, you can perhaps trace the roots of communalism and communal living and so on to small tribes in the Middle East and in Israel and Africa, but the actual sort of theoretical grounding of Marxism is also from Western civilization. Marx was from Eastern Europe, and Engels and the development of this ideology largely comes from Western thought. It's actually somewhat jarring. Sometimes, my educational background is in China, and it was really jarring to me when I saw in the Chinese legislature they had a big portrait of Marx up on the wall, and it's this white guy, this Westerner, looming over China is the basis of its entire economic model. Touching on your later point about how nice China's going to be, I am just to be transparent. I mean, you've probably already picked up on this. I am a Sinophile, so I do have an optimistic view of China's contribution to the world and its potential as a power. But I think that I think based on what we know is that what China is doing is it's offering an alternative to countries, and it's not just Africa. It's also been doing this to Pacific powers. I think I might be wrong in this, but I think it's the Solomon Islands that recently signed essentially a defense pact with China, and I think the view was it'd be one of China's first overseas military bases. So they're experimenting with the production of hard power, but what China does is it offers an alternative to these countries through things like the Brick and Road Initiative, through overseas foreign direct investment. And the way how China approaches the world is one where it doesn't belittle or demand, at least from what we've seen so far, other countries to change the ways. So I'm not quite sure where I was driving this point, but I don't think that we're going to see China imposing hard power on Africa anytime soon. Maybe some military bases, but I think that's more a front of its Cold War with the West. I don't expect Chinese military intervention in Africa or Latin America in the same way the West has done with coups trying to impose itself on other countries. So yeah, broadly optimistic in that regard.
Oh, well, I understood, but definitely, I hope so. But I'm just saying, this is just a question that I ask myself, soft power until when? Well, to be honest, what they can do always is basically hit you financially, which is basically what the West does anyway with African countries. They put sanction until the country crumbles. But that's still a soft power. The other thing that you touch is very important about Karl Marx. I think the alternative to capitalism is probably not Marxism. Although China might try to use it, me personally, this is me thinking. I think that not even globalization, also globalization, as you said, Generation Z, millennials, this is it. Alter globalization is basically one of the things that will topple capitalism. Until the West still adapted, the West is going to lose its great civilization. I'm saying this why. Take an example. Wherever you go these days, Stephen, someone has got a camera filming, or a couple of tweets, you're basically demoted. Everyone is basically becoming, an activist. So out of globalization has given us the opportunity. For example, during Sarah Everett's, march, this young lady that the police was basically malhandled. It takes like a couple of photos, and suddenly, Cressida Dick find ourselves in the hot water with the Met, with Wayne Couzens, what he did and things like that. So I think not just financially, but socially, also globalization might be the savior for the Western civilization. But to how long? For how long, basically? Sorry, that's my question. For how long will auto-globalization will basically save the Western civilization? For example, you see flood happening in Pakistan, suddenly the people are organizing themselves. You see what's happening in Ukraine, people are organizing themselves on social media, donating, picking up things and taking. That's basically part of the Western civilization, you see. But if they hang on to the capitalism and think, oh yeah, for example, these are just only our people, blue eyes, blonde hair, but we don't care what happened to Asia or what happened to Africa. Well, in that case, this civilization is going to have a problem, because those people are watching and they are not going to be happy with that civilization is thinking of them. One way or another, they will basically think, you know what, enough is enough. If you basically think that your civilization only concerns that people that you have over there, even though you think that you brought us the same civilization, then obviously your civilization is not good to us. See? So I'm thinking that also globalization is probably the way forward for the Western civilization, rather than the capitalism that might be its downfall. I hope you see my argument, what I'm trying to go with this, not just economically, but socially, I think this is basically something that the Western civilization needs to consider, because that's what China is doing at the moment. You know, China, before even Britain and the West started giving vaccine, China started donating vaccine, Russia started donating vaccine to African countries. You know, but Britain has got more. All they were thinking, yeah, we will do three boats, then we will send maybe, you know, they are reserve boats. We all know that. Johnson refused to send some in Africa, but it was China and Russia giving that to Africans. But is that really a civilization that you can call great? Again, that will circle me back to, you know, my ideology at the beginning. See, so the civilization is great, but to what point? Or for whom again? These are the things that I consider. So alter globalization might be the savior of the Western civilization if they adopt it. They create many ideology. Alter globalization might be one of the savior, in my view, for their civilization. If not, they still stick with what they are doing now, then that will be the downfall of the civilization. Because I will not follow your civilization, even if you're going to kill me, if another civilization is going to give me a better benefit. Simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on alter globalization. I do have to go away and do more research into that. So thank you. Just to come to some of those points, the vaccine issue. Yeah, I mean, I cite, so I have some friends who are definitely what you would call like traditional British hawks. You know, against China, very, very critical of China, and always have been, even before the pandemic, when Britain was trying to establish what it called golden era relations with China. We want to be their best friend in the West. It feels like ancient history now if you look at the stuff coming out of British politicians. But yeah, I often cite the vaccine, of how China was very keen for its vaccine technology to be what the Chinese government called a public good. Essentially making it open source, which very much differs from the European and American approach of patents and large pharmaceutical companies. And this is where I was keen for to be a little bit anonymous in this conversation, because I do actually work within the healthcare industry, so I do have to be cautious here about Western pharmaceutical companies, their approach to the vaccine. Completely abhorrent, I think. I mean, sure, they donated some, but you look at how that was distributed. Was it fairly? No. But the just a couple more points on that as well in the context of civilization. You talk about Ukraine. I actually see Ukraine as one of these clash of civilizations, and you call it Russian civilization, but in the book Clash of Civilization is referred to as the Orthodox civilization, so basically Russian.
Yes, Orthodox. Sorry, that's the name I was looking for. Russian, Russian civilization is the Orthodox. Yeah.
Ukraine is one of the first real challenges to Western civilization. There's this great front of which is going to prevail in this border country. Is the ideas of Western liberal democracy going to prevail in this front in Ukraine, or is it going to be orthodoxy? Or perhaps, if you're a bit pessimistic, is it just going to end up being on a wasteland? But this is one of the great fronts of a civilizational conflict, and the West is entering an existential crisis, and it is in decline. But I think we both believe it's in decline. Perhaps Lap is a shame he's disconnected, because I think we both are critics of capitalism, whereas I think Lap would rush to its defense. So it's a bit shame not to have that alternative view in there. But what I would say is, if just coming to the question, is Western civilization the greatest civilization? I would say, just because it's in this existential crisis, just because we think it's in its end day, its late stage, doesn't mean that it wasn't the greatest civilization. Nothing lasts forever, but I think that so far, and in the present day, it is still the greatest civilization. It's just in its twilight era.
True, yeah, true, and you're right. To conclude, yes, it's the great civilization, but to whom? You know, to whom? That's the thing. To whom? Because so far, it's only beneficial for some and not to all. So is a Western civilization the greatest? For me, that rest to see. Hopefully, things might change in my lifetime. But the way things are going, I don't think that Africa will benefit from this great civilization of the West. Because for me, we're still basically under the same kind of ideology they colonized in Africa in the first place. They are going to bring us civilization, and we're still waiting for that civilization to come. So I can't judge a civilization as an African. I can't tell a civilization is great as an African if I haven't benefited from it yet. But we'll wait to see. And as an academic, with all the things that the Western civilization has accomplished, I can basically say that there are very good things that come out of the Western civilization. We can say many things from I don't know, the Industrial Revolution to back in the Renaissance, all the way to the modern day technology that is rolling out. So all in all, yes, as an academic, I cannot basically close my eyes and pretend that does not exist. But as an African, as someone who was basically colonized under the pretext of uncivilized, because they're going to bring me a civilization, that rest to be seen. I'm still basically waiting to see that great civilization to basically be expanded on my continent. Thank you.
Next one. I mean, I share a very similar sentiment as well. Like, seeing as how it's not going to be a very sustainable model for being the best, I will kind of question whether that would come into play in some consideration at all. But for the most part, yeah, I do agree with all the points and the bits of like how the many inventions, the laptops that we have today, the platforms that we're speaking on, the scientific method, all of those things were part of Western civilization, Western culture. It's undeniable. And of course, if I'm proven wrong and like the next 100 years doesn't see the whole end of the world from being torched on itself due to global warming and all that, then yeah, sure. Like obviously, it wasn't a civilization that ended the world, and it was the best for its time of how it ran. Any closing thoughts, SJ?
I'm aware that we're sort of winding down, and I'm probably about to throw another bomb in the conversation. So I apologize for that in advance if it happens. But I would say that you have benefited from Western civilization. Like, yes, horrible things have happened, colonization, imperialism, and oppression, but you benefit from many great contributions from Western civilization today. And I'm not just talking about the laptop that you're on and the internet that you're using, but more theoretical concepts, the rights of freedom of speech, the fact we're allowed to have this conversation, concepts of you as an individual, all sort of stems from Western thought. You can go back as far as the Magna Carta when the Lords first started taking their rights from the monarch. You enjoy benefits provided from Western thought, from Western developments, and not just tangible things, but concepts.
John, sorry, Stephen, quickly on that note, before the colonialism, Africa was basically, I know because my family is a noble family, believe it or not, before the arrival of the Western civilization in Africa, everyone was living like during King John's, every man's house is a castle. We have a voice, they have a voice, a woman have voice and everything. It's when we have colonialism that we lost our freedom of speech. And this is one of the reasons, I told you that I'm a person seeking sanctuary in UK. That's one of the reasons, the Western civilization, that I thought I have my freedom of speech in my country. That's why I ran to here in this country. So again, did I benefit from that in my country? Again, rest to see, because I thought I had my freedom of speech. I thought I can express myself. And that's why I'm a person seeking sanctuary in UK now. Do you see where I'm going with that? So it's really, again, before that, in Africa, believe it or not, even my grandparents, my granddad, I'm an old boy, but my granddad, my mom's dad, I sit there and chat with him. He basically tells me things that were happening before the colonialism, because he died at old age. Me, myself, I'm 45 years old, believe it or not. And my mom and my dad were basically born during the Second World War, before the Second World War, if I might say so. So, before all that happened, my granddad is still basically telling me stories that they used to be able to do as a community. You have a problem with your neighbor, you solve it between you. And in a polite way, you basically have the freedom of speech, even in the King's Court at any time. You don't have to ask audiences or something. You just walk in the throne room and then speak. But all that is gone in our countries now. They have a structure, proper governance. But when the Western civilization came, they basically put in place administrations. And those administrations are actually like racist, not favorable for anyone. So again, what point colonialism were basically good for us? Western civilization was good for us. I thought it's basically the civilization I can elect the person I want. If I elect, they are not counting that, they are frauding, they are causing fraud. And if I speak, or if I want to demonstrate, I get beaten. If I try to educate children about their rights, what the Western civilization told me, basically I'm causing trouble for basically empowering the young students. So as a person who is seeking sanctuary in UK, this is one of the reasons, again, that I'm saying it's really a gray area for me, Stephen. I hope you understand.
No, I do. And I guess this is where I do have I have to confess my ignorance on pre-colonial African civilizations. But what I guess the point I was trying to make more about things, say like the Magna Carta and so on, the West has established international norms, codified norms on things such as human rights and a general sense of the power of the individual. I mean, I'm not familiar with these African civilizations, but I am curious if you could go to the king's court and openly criticize the king, how well that would go down. I'm also a bit hesitant to look back on these ancient civilizations with rose-colored glasses and did everyone just peacefully solve the solutions, the problems? Probably not. I think there probably was tribal warfare. These great empires of Africa didn't just arise peacefully. There was still conquest and still violence. But I would say I would say that you've probably benefited in your lifetime from codified Western ideas of human rights and freedom of speech and similar things like that. In terms of whether that is existing, you look at the UK and how Priti Patel has removed the right to protest. You can see how the far right has just won an election in Italy, how it's always on the verge of winning elections in France. Fascism and its goal of removing
in Hungary.
Yeah, Hungary is another excellent one.
Viktor Orban.
These, I would say, are symptoms of decline of a civilization, and we're doing circles here. And we talk about whether the sustainability of the civilization means it was great. I come back to nothing lasts forever. It runs in cycles. But just because we are in the late stage of a civilization, the twilight, its decline, I still maintain my position that it was one of the greatest civilizations, and still is for now. One of the best civilization that we have. But it's just an awkward conversation to have, because no, it isn't. It's twilight. If we were having this conversation 50 years ago, it would be a very different conversation. But because we are in its twilight years, it's a complex one to have. But I would still maintain my stance that yes, it's declining. Yes, it's an end. Yes, it's finite. But from what we've experienced so far, it has been the greatest in human civilization.
I understand. I understand it, Stephen, definitely. And I basically respect your position. And the same, I do know that, it's one of the greatest civilization in the world, so far. But for whom, for whom is that really beneficial? So, yeah, definitely, I understand that. I do have to go because I've got a meeting at 6 o'clock, everyone. Apologies, honestly. But this is really good. Hopefully, as you said, Stephen, you will basically check on African history. And I too, I will expand my knowledge on, continental Asia. And we can basically have another chat, really, if time permitted. But before I go, there is a new film coming out based on a true story. It's called The Woman King. It's basically for, I was talking to you, if you know many of empire, probably you heard of it. It's called the Dahomey Empire, Benin, modern day Benin. So it's basically the Dahomey Empire, the real life Amazonians, people thought they were legend or something like that. No, they're real life warrior women in Africa. And that was basically, they even fought against the colonial penetration during the missionary and the colonial times. They actually fought even against the British. So the film is coming out the 4th of October. It will be good for you to basically have the opportunity to know a little bit about that. And also the bronze statue that you keep hearing are in the National Museum of History in London. Some were taken from there to brought in Britain. Again, that's part of the civilization that we inherit from the British. But yeah, if you have a chance, please, anyone, go watch it in cinema. I know it's different. Maybe the book will be better than that, but it's based on a true story, more or less very, very accurate. The women are real life warriors that are basically guard the kingdom and the king. And they are called the Dahomey women, the Amazons in modern day Benin.
Right. Yeah. I love how we just had all this in this conversation and ended off with a trailer for the movie. Great. Go Capitalism. I would love to have a spin-off conversation with you both on whatever was said about the nuances, and maybe we could actually arrange for a call maybe sometime later down the month or next month, to even talk about different stuff, like different topics that we're interested about. Like, how does that sound to you both?
Global warming. Yeah, global warming or something like that, topics. But definitely, and I will up my game in Southeast Asia and Asia continental, and a little bit of philosophy, Stephen, because I would love to basically get into the domain that, you're good at. What did you major, did you say? What did you, your master's?
Yeah, I did my bachelor's in international relations, and my master's was in diplomacy, specifically focusing in East Asian diplomacy. I just wanted to say that this is my first time doing a podcast style online debate, and I quite enjoyed it. I would be keen to talk more. I think there are a lot of things that we touched on that we could expand in more detail, different conversations, capitalism versus alternatives. Perhaps me and Shams might be quite aligned in criticizing capitalism, but it'd be good to bring in
a different ideology.
Yeah, we could team up together. But yeah, I think there's a lot of topics that we could potentially discuss and then talk together. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
No, thank you both, and thanks Agent P for facilitating this. Again, really a blast. I'm so sorry I gotta go. I've got 5 minutes to make myself a cuppa. We didn't even have a break, but that's how good the conversation was. But yeah, thank you both, and I see you soon, very soon, hopefully next month.
Definitely. Yeah, I enjoyed this. Take care, you guys.
All
Thank
right,
you.
bye. Have a great week ahead, everyone. Nikki,
Bye.
it's very late where you are. Go get some sleep.
Got work tomorrow too.